Good evening, dear listeners. As the sun gently retreats and the world around us begins to quiet, I invite you to settle into a comfortable position. Allow your body to relax, your mind to unwind, and your breath to find its natural rhythm. In this serene space, we will embark on a journey through the enchanting yet often overlooked world of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes. Tonight, we will explore an intriguing aspect of history that dances between the art of creativity and the structure of governance. Marginalia, those delightful little notes and illustrations that adorn the edges of ancient texts, were not merely whimsical distractions, they carried a weight of meaning and context in a time when the written word was sacred. As we delve into this sleepy subject, let the soothing cadence of my voice guide you into a peaceful state, where your thoughts can drift like leaves upon a gentle stream. We will begin our exploration by examining the origins of manuscript production in the medieval period, a time when each book was a labor of love, painstakingly crafted by hand. Imagine the flickering candlelight illuminating the workbench of a scribe, the rhythmic scratch of quill against parchment, as vibrant illustrations come to life. We'll uncover how these early artisans not only focused on the primary text but also left their marks, quite literally, on the margins, weaving tales of humor, commentary, and sometimes even rebellion into the fabric of the pages. Next, we will meander through the complex labyrinth of approval processes that govern these delightful embellishments. In a world where every letter could hold profound significance, the approval of marginalia was no trivial matter. We will explore the roles of scribes, illuminators, and the ecclesiastical authorities who held the reins of power over what was deemed acceptable in the margins of sacred texts. Picture the deliberation and care involved in deciding whether a playful doodle or a thought-provoking annotation would be permitted to grace the edges of a manuscript. As we journey deeper, we will encounter fascinating stories of individual manuscripts and their unique paths through the approval gauntlet. Together, we will discover how the marginalia reflected the cultural, social, and political climates of their time, offering us a window into the thoughts and feelings of our medieval ancestors. Each tale, each illustration, is a thread woven into the rich tapestry of human expression, and we will take the time to appreciate the artistry and intention behind these seemingly simple notes. Throughout our voyage, the flow of history can sometimes feel overwhelming, but tonight, we will take it slowly, allowing each detail to settle softly like a feather on a still pond. As we prepare to dive into the main content, let your eyelids grow heavy, your breathing slow, and your mind open to the soothing tales of the past. Remember, this journey is not only about the history of marginalia but also about finding tranquility in the stories that have shaped our world. With each gentle word, I hope to lull you into a state of relaxation, where the echoes of the past blend seamlessly with the present, encouraging a deep and restful sleep. So, dear listeners, let us now turn our attention to the first chapter of our exploration, where the flickering candlelight of the scribe's workspace illuminates the beginnings of our captivating tale on medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow the soothing sounds of history to carry you away into a peaceful slumber. The origins of the approval processes for marginalia in medieval manuscripts can be traced back to the early 9th century in the Carolingian Empire, particularly within the monastic communities that proliferated across regions such as modern-day France and Germany. The practice of marginalia, which encompasses the annotations, illustrations, and commentary written in the margins of codices, emerged as a significant aspect of manuscript culture. The earliest recorded instances of such marginal notes can be found in the works produced at the Abbey of St. Gall, founded around 720 AD in what is now Switzerland. By 830 AD, under the abbacy of Notker Balbulus, the Abbey of St. Gall became a prominent center for the production of manuscripts. This institution saw the establishment of formalized procedures regarding the inclusion of marginalia. The architectural layout of the monastery included a scriptorium, a dedicated space for copying texts, which was equipped with desks made of sturdy wood, typically oak, and illuminated by natural light from large, semicircular windows. The scriptorium was often adjacent to the library, where completed manuscripts were stored on wooden shelves. The administrative procedures concerning the approval of marginalia were notably influenced by the monastic rules established by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century. These rules emphasized the importance of order and discipline within monastic life. As such, a formal hierarchy developed within the scriptorium that specified roles for the monks involved in the manuscript production process. The head of the scriptorium, or the scriptor, as he was referred to, would oversee the work of copyists and artists, and it was his responsibility to review any marginalia before it could be included in a manuscript. Each day in the scriptorium commenced at dawn with the ringing of the bell, signaling the monks to gather for morning prayers. Following the liturgical observances, the monks would proceed to their designated workstations. The process of copying texts was laborious and time-consuming, often taking several months to complete a single manuscript. The approval of marginalia was an integral part of this process, as it required not only artistic skill but also theological and doctrinal adherence. By the mid-10th century, as the practice of marginalia became more widespread, the need for a more structured approval process became evident. This led to the formation of a committee within the monastic community, which included the abbot, the head scriptor, and select senior monks. The committee would convene weekly, typically on the first day of the week, to review any marginal notes submitted by the monks. These meetings were often held in the chapter house, a designated space within the monastery characterized by its vaulted ceilings and stone walls, which served as a venue for communal decision-making. During these committee meetings, the monks were required to present their marginalia for scrutiny. Each submission was examined for its relevance to the primary text, its theological implications, and its artistic execution. The approval process was meticulous. If the marginalia was deemed inappropriate or not in line with the doctrinal teachings of the Church, it would be rejected. This rejection was often accompanied by a notation in the manuscript itself, providing a record of the committee's decision. In the years that followed, specifically during the late 11th century, the practice of marginalia became increasingly sophisticated. Manuscripts produced in the region of northern France, particularly in the city of Amiens, began to feature elaborate marginal illustrations alongside commentaries. The approval process adapted accordingly, as the artistic elements of marginalia became subject to the same scrutiny as the textual annotations. This period saw the emergence of designated artists, often referred to as miniaturists, who specialized in the creation of marginal illustrations. The approval of artistic marginalia necessitated the establishment of a distinct set of criteria, which included considerations of aesthetic quality, thematic relevance, and adherence to the iconographic traditions of the Church. The miniaturists were required to submit their designs to the committee for evaluation. These submissions would typically include sketches, often drawn on parchment scraps, which were reviewed in conjunction with the textual annotations they accompanied. As the 12th century progressed, the growing influence of universities and the rise of scholasticism led to further developments in the approval processes of marginalia. The University of Paris, established in the first half of the 12th century, became a hub for intellectual discourse, and its scholars began to produce manuscripts for educational purposes. The incorporation of marginal annotations to elucidate complex theological arguments became a common practice among scholars. In response to these changes, the approval processes were formalized into a more bureaucratic structure. The committee responsible for evaluating marginalia began to include scholars from outside the monastery, leading to a diversification of perspectives on the appropriateness of marginal notes. These committees were often referred to as consistories, and meetings would be held in the university's lecture halls, which were characterized by their wooden benches and stone pillars. The administrative procedures adopted by these consistories involved a detailed record-keeping system. Manuscripts submitted for approval were logged, and the decisions made regarding marginalia were documented meticulously. Each entry included the date of submission, the name of the submitting monk or scholar, a description of the marginalia, and the outcome of the review. This practice not only ensured accountability but also contributed to the development of a standardized approach to the approval of marginalia across different regions. By the 13th century, the proliferation of printed texts, spurred by the advent of the printing press in the latter part of the century, began to impact the traditional manuscript culture. While the approval processes for marginalia in manuscripts remained largely intact, there was a notable shift in focus. The marginalia in printed texts, particularly those produced in the emerging centers of Venice and Mainz, often bypassed the rigorous approval processes that had characterized manuscript production. Despite this shift, the legacy of the medieval approval processes for marginalia continued to influence manuscript culture well into the Renaissance. The meticulous attention to detail and the emphasis on theological conformity established during the medieval period laid the groundwork for subsequent generations of scholars and scribes. The administrative structures developed to oversee these processes became integral components of the educational institutions that emerged in the early modern period. In conclusion, the history of the approval processes for marginalia within medieval manuscripts reflects a complex interplay of theological, artistic, and administrative considerations. From the early monastic communities of the Carolingian Empire to the academic institutions of the 13th century, the evolution of these processes underscores the significance of marginalia as both a literary and visual form of commentary. The routines and procedures established during this period not only shaped the production of manuscripts but also contributed to the broader intellectual and cultural milieu of the Middle Ages. The enduring legacy of these approval processes serves as a testament to the intricate nature of manuscript culture and the profound impact of marginalia on the transmission of knowledge throughout history. The construction methods and materials employed in the production of medieval manuscripts were critical to the approval processes of marginalia. Manuscripts were predominantly composed of parchment, a durable writing surface made from animal skin, particularly lamb, goat, or calf. The average size of a sheet of parchment ranged from 12 to 15 inches in width and 14 to 20 inches in height, though sizes could vary significantly based on the intended use. The process of creating parchment involved several meticulous steps, including the collection of skins, soaking in a lime solution for dehairing, stretching on frames, and scraping to achieve a smooth surface. This process could take anywhere from a few weeks to several months, depending on environmental conditions and the skill of the craftsperson. In addition to parchment, quills made from the flight feathers of birds, most commonly geese, were the primary writing instruments. The quill's tip required periodic sharpening, which was performed with a knife, while ink was typically composed of carbon black mixed with a binder, such as gum arabic. The ink was stored in inkwells, often crafted from glass or ceramic, that varied in height from 2 to 4 inches and in diameter from 1 to 3 inches, reflecting local artisan styles and available materials. Maintenance procedures for manuscripts were as rigorous as their construction. Scribes and illuminators were often responsible for the upkeep of their works, which included regular inspections for signs of wear, discoloration, or pest damage. In particular, manuscripts were vulnerable to insects such as booklice and silverfish, which could consume the organic materials. The average lifespan of a manuscript, with proper care, could extend to several centuries, although environmental factors such as humidity and temperature played significant roles in their degradation. To mitigate such risks, manuscripts were often stored in protective cases or shelves made of wood, with dimensions approximating 6 feet in height, 3 feet in width, and 1 foot in depth, allowing for vertical stacking of volumes. The financial records associated with the approval processes for marginalia reveal the economic complexities involved in manuscript production. In the late 12th century, for instance, a single volume could cost anywhere from 5 to 20 shillings, depending on the intricacy of the marginalia and the quality of the materials used. Labor costs contributed significantly to overall expenses. Skilled scribes could earn between 1 and 3 pence per hour, while illuminators were often compensated at a higher rate, sometimes reaching 4 pence per hour due to their specialized skills. Records from the period suggest that a scribe could complete approximately 1 to 2 folios, each folio consisting of 2 pages, per day, translating to a labor cost of 2 to 6 pence per folio. The financial burdens were compounded by the costs of pigments, which could vary widely based on sourcing. For example, lapis lazuli, a blue pigment derived from Afghanistan, could cost as much as 15 shillings per ounce, making it a luxury item reserved for manuscripts of significant importance. The personnel involved in the manuscript production and approval process were diverse, each with specific job descriptions that contributed to the overall effectiveness of the operation. At the top of the hierarchy was the master scribe, responsible for overseeing the project and ensuring that all texts were copied accurately. Below the master scribe were journeyman scribes, who executed the copying under supervision, alongside apprentice scribes, who were in training and typically completed simpler tasks such as preparing parchment and mixing ink. Illuminators held a critical role, specializing in the application of decorative elements, including marginalia. They often worked alongside scribes and had knowledge of both artistic techniques and the significance of the texts they adorned. The role of the marginalia approver, a less common but essential position, emerged in the late 13th century. This individual was tasked with reviewing the marginal notes added by scribes and illuminators to ensure they adhered to established conventions and theological accuracy. The technical specifications of manuscript production were dictated by both the tools used and the methodologies employed. For instance, the ruling of the parchment was often done with a straight edge and a blunt stylus, creating lines that guided the scribe in maintaining uniformity in text alignment. Ruling would typically involve a margin of 1 inch on all sides, with the main body of the text occupying a space of approximately 4 to 6 inches in width. Notably, the spacing between lines, known as leading, was typically set at 1/4 to half an inch, depending on the scribe's preferences and the overall aesthetic of the manuscript. The creation of marginalia itself followed a series of unwritten guidelines that were often dictated by regional traditions. For example, in English manuscripts from the 14th century, marginalia frequently included commentary, humorous illustrations, or moral reflections. In contrast, French manuscripts of the same period tended to feature more elaborate decorative forms, including intricate border designs and multicolored initials. During the approval process, marginalia underwent a series of evaluations. The first step involved a peer review by fellow scribes, who would assess the relevance and appropriateness of the marginal notes in relation to the main text. This process could take several days, with discussions often extending into the evenings, as scribes debated the merits of various annotations. Following peer review, the marginalia approver would conduct a final assessment, providing feedback that could include suggestions for revision or outright rejection of certain annotations. The administrative aspect of the approval processes was meticulously documented. Ledger books from the late 14th century reveal entries that detail the dates of approval, the names of the responsible scribes, and any associated costs. One entry from 1395 indicates that a particular manuscript, noted for its extensive marginalia, underwent 3 revisions before final approval, resulting in a cumulative labor cost of 8 shillings and 6 pence. In conclusion, the tedious history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes can be dissected into various components, including construction methods and materials, maintenance procedures, financial records and costs, personnel and job descriptions, and technical specifications. Each aspect, while seemingly mundane, contributed to the broader cultural significance of marginalia in manuscript culture. The meticulous attention to detail in every phase of manuscript production underscored the importance of preserving knowledge and facilitating scholarly discourse during the medieval period. As such, the practices surrounding marginalia approval not only reflect the technical abilities of those involved but also speak to the values and priorities of a society deeply engaged in the pursuit of knowledge. The construction methods and materials utilized in the production of medieval manuscripts, particularly concerning the marginalia approval processes, were as varied as they were intricate. Manuscripts from the early medieval period, approximately 500 to 1000 AD, were predominantly constructed using animal skins, particularly vellum, which was favored for its durability and capacity to hold ink. Vellum, derived from the skins of calves, lambs, or goats, was processed through a labor-intensive method that involved soaking, scraping, and stretching the hides. The average size of a typical folio was approximately 25 centimeters by 35 centimeters, although variations existed based on the intended use of the manuscript. By the 12th century, the use of parchment became more widespread, as it was less expensive than vellum and readily available. Parchment was made from the skins of older animals, such as sheep or goats, and generally measured around 20 centimeters by 30 centimeters. The selection of skins was critical. Scribes and illuminators preferred skins that were free from blemishes and imperfections. This attention to detail underscores the meticulous nature of the approval processes that govern marginalia, as any visible flaws could hinder the manuscript's acceptance by patrons or ecclesiastical authorities. In terms of maintenance procedures, the care of these manuscripts was paramount to their longevity. Manuscripts were often stored in specially designed wooden cases lined with cloth to protect them from dust and light, which could degrade the quality of the ink and parchment. Regular inspections were conducted, typically by appointed custodians, who would check for signs of wear, such as fraying edges or fading ink. It was not uncommon for these custodians to record their findings in maintenance logs, which detailed the condition of each manuscript, any repairs performed, and the materials used in those repairs. For instance, a common repair procedure involved the use of a mixture of egg white and water to reattach loose folios, a technique documented as early as the 11th century in various monastic records. Financial records and costs associated with the production and maintenance of manuscripts provide further insight into the economic implications of marginalia approval processes. The cost of vellum could range from 1 to 5 pence per skin, depending on the quality and thickness. Given that a single manuscript could require anywhere from 50 to 200 skins, the total expenditure on materials alone could reach upwards of 10 shillings, a significant sum in the context of 12th century England. These financial records were often meticulously maintained by the monastic treasurers, who would itemize expenditures on inks, pigments, and gold leaf for illuminations, each element carefully documented to ensure accountability and transparency in the approval process. The appointment of personnel and the delineation of job descriptions were critical aspects of manuscript production. Scribes, who were responsible for the transcription of texts, typically underwent rigorous training, often as apprentices from a young age. An apprentice scribe could expect to spend at least 7 years mastering the art of calligraphy, culminating in the production of a masterwork that would be submitted for approval by a senior scribe or monk. This masterwork would often be a demonstration of their proficiency in various styles of writing, such as Carolingian minuscule or Gothic script, both of which had distinct characteristics and were subject to specific approval standards. In addition to scribes, illuminators played a vital role in the embellishment of manuscripts, particularly in the creation of marginalia. The marginalia, often comprising intricate illustrations or annotations, were not only decorative but also served to enhance the text's meaning. Illuminators were skilled artisans who specialized in the application of pigments made from natural sources, including crushed gemstones, vegetable dyes, and metallic powders. The approval of marginalia often required collaboration between scribes and illuminators, as the placement and content of illustrations needed to complement the text. This interplay was governed by a series of unwritten conventions, with illuminators often seeking approval from the scribe on the appropriateness of their designs before final application. Technical specifications for the production of manuscripts were rigorously outlined in various treatises of the time. The late 13th century saw the emergence of detailed guides that specified the dimensions of letters, the spacing of lines, and the use of abbreviations. For instance, a standard line of text was typically composed of 15 to 20 characters, with a line height of approximately 1.5 centimeters. The use of specific abbreviations, such as the Tyronian notes, was commonplace and allowed for more efficient transcription, although their use required a thorough understanding of the system, a detail that became a point of contention during marginalia approval processes. Furthermore, the ink used in manuscripts was a subject of considerable importance. The most common ink was made from a mixture of carbon black and gum arabic, which created a dark, durable writing medium. The preparation of this ink involved precise measurements. A typical recipe called for 1 part gum to 10 parts water, with additional components such as vinegar or wine being added to enhance the ink's longevity. The application of ink was closely monitored during the approval process, as variations in thickness could lead to inconsistencies in text clarity, a detail noted in the approval logs maintained by scribes. The approval process for marginalia itself was often a complex interplay of artistic interpretation and textual fidelity. The margins of manuscripts were not merely blank spaces, they were considered an extension of the text, a canvas for commentary and illustration that required careful negotiation between the authorial intent and the visual representation. In some cases, church authorities mandated specific iconographies or themes for marginal illustrations, reflecting broader theological or societal concerns. For example, during the late 12th century, the depiction of moral and ethical allegories became prevalent, necessitating a review process that involved theological scholars who would assess the appropriateness of the imagery in relation to the text. This review process could be quite extensive. It typically involved the gathering of a panel comprising the scribe, the illuminator, and a designated approver, often a senior monk or scholar. The panel would convene in the scriptorium, where each piece of marginalia was scrutinized for its alignment with the manuscript's overall theme and textual integrity. The approval would often culminate in a formal endorsement, recorded in the manuscript's colophon, which would include the date of approval and the names of those involved in the process. Such records serve as invaluable historical documents, providing insight into the collaborative nature of manuscript production and the importance placed on marginalia. In conclusion, the history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes is a multifaceted tapestry woven from the threads of construction methods, maintenance procedures, financial records, personnel roles, and technical specifications. Each element played a critical role in ensuring that manuscripts not only served their intended purpose as repositories of knowledge but also reflected the cultural and intellectual aspirations of the society from which they emerged. Through the meticulous efforts of scribes, illuminators, and approvers, these documents became lasting artifacts of a bygone era, their marginalia offering a glimpse into the thoughts, values, and artistic expressions of medieval life. As such, the study of marginalia approval processes provides a significant lens through which to examine the broader historical context of medieval manuscripts, illuminating the interplay between text and image, art and authority, and tradition and innovation. The construction methods and materials employed in the production of medieval manuscripts, particularly with regard to marginalia, reveal a considerable degree of variation influenced by geographical location, available resources, and the prevailing cultural practices of the time. The primary material used for the creation of the manuscript pages was parchment, which was derived from the skin of animals, predominantly sheep, Bovis aries, goats, Capre gagris hircus, and calves, Bos taurus. The choice of parchment over paper, which began to become more prevalent in the late medieval period, was due partly to the durability of parchment. The thickness of parchment sheets typically ranged from 0.2 to 0.5 millimeters, depending on the specific use case and the animal from which it was sourced. The process of preparing parchment was intricate and labor-intensive. Initially, the animal skins were soaked in a solution of lime, which facilitated the removal of hair and flesh. Following this, the skins were stretched on a frame to dry, a process that could take several days, approximately 4 to 7 days, depending on humidity. Once dried, the parchment was scraped with a blunt knife to achieve the desired smoothness, with the final product being cut into standard sizes, such as quires of 8, 12, or 16 leaves, each leaf measuring approximately 29 by 21 centimeters. In terms of ink, a common recipe involved the combination of carbon black, water, and a binding agent, typically gum arabic. This mixture was used to create a rich black ink, which was often accompanied by colored inks made from various plant and mineral sources. For example, red ink was frequently derived from vermilion, while blue might come from azurite or indigo. These inks were applied using quills derived from the feathers of birds, predominantly geese or swans, which were sharpened to a point and could be used for both writing and decoration. The maintenance of manuscripts, particularly those with extensive marginalia, was critical to preserving their integrity and readability. The practice of rebinding and repairing manuscripts became standardized over time, with parchment leaves being sewn together using linen or silk thread. This process was typically performed by a binder, whose skills were honed over years of apprenticeship. The binding process often included the addition of wooden boards covered with leather, which served to protect the fragile pages within. The leather was often dyed, with colors such as dark brown or black being most common. Financial records from monastic scriptoria, such as the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, provide insights into the costs associated with manuscript production and maintenance. For instance, in 1080, the abbey accounted for expenditures on parchment, ink, and quills, amounting to approximately 50 solidi, a significant sum at the time. This figure reflects the labor costs associated with skilled scribes, who were often compensated at a rate of 2 solidi per day, in addition to the costs of materials. It is noteworthy that the financial management of such projects often required meticulous bookkeeping, with records maintained in the monastery's ledger detailing each transaction related to manuscript production. The personnel involved in the creation and maintenance of manuscripts typically included scribes, illuminators, and binders, each with distinct job descriptions and specialized skills. Scribes, responsible for the transcription of texts onto parchment, were often educated in Latin and trained in the art of calligraphy. Their writing styles varied, with Gothic and Carolingian scripts being the most common during the early to late medieval periods, respectively. Illuminators, on the other hand, were tasked with the decoration of manuscripts, particularly the embellishment of initials or the addition of detailed marginalia. This role required both artistic talent and knowledge of iconography, as the imagery often held significant meaning related to the text. The role of the binder, although less celebrated than that of the scribe or illuminator, was equally essential, as the durability of the manuscript depended on their craftsmanship. Binders were responsible for sewing the quires together, attaching the covers, and ensuring that the manuscript could withstand the rigors of handling over time. Records from the late 12th century indicate that a skilled binder could produce approximately 5 to 8 completed manuscripts per month. Technical specifications of medieval manuscripts also contribute to our understanding of the production process. A notable example is the standardization of quire structures. A typical quire consisted of 4 to 8 folded sheets of parchment, resulting in a total of 8 to 16 leaves per quire. The alignment of the text was often centered, with margins typically measuring 2 to 4 centimeters, allowing for the inclusion of marginalia. The use of ruling, which involved creating faint lines on the parchment, was essential to maintain uniformity in text placement. Ruling was performed using a straightedge and a stylus, with the lines often being barely visible to the naked eye but serving as a crucial guide for the scribe. The interplay between text and marginalia was dictated not only by aesthetic preferences but also by the approval processes that governed the creation of manuscripts. The marginalia, consisting of annotations, illustrations, or commentary, were often subject to review by a designated authority within the monastic community. This oversight was intended to ensure that the content of the marginalia aligned with theological principles and did not detract from the primary text. Records indicate that this approval process could take several weeks, during which the manuscript would be scrutinized for both textual accuracy and the appropriateness of visual elements. Furthermore, the approval process was often documented in the form of marginal notes or annotations within the manuscript itself. For example, the use of a red ink rubric could indicate that a specific marginal note had received approval, while a crossed-out note might signify disapproval. Such annotations illustrate the dynamic relationship between text and commentary, whereby the marginalia served both to enhance and to clarify the main narrative, all while remaining under the watchful eye of ecclesiastical authority. In conclusion, the tedious history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes encompasses a wide array of components, including construction methods, materials, maintenance procedures, financial records, personnel roles, and technical specifications. Each of these elements contributes to a more comprehensive understanding of the intricate systems that govern manuscript production in the Middle Ages. The meticulous nature of this work, coupled with the layers of oversight and approval required, underscores the significance of marginalia as not merely decorative but as essential components of the broader manuscript tradition. The interplay between text and image, art and authority, tradition and innovation continues to offer fertile ground for further scholarly examination, revealing the rich tapestry of medieval intellectual and cultural life. The construction methods and materials employed in the production of medieval manuscripts are of paramount importance to understanding the context of marginalia approval processes. The primary materials utilized in the creation of manuscripts during the medieval period included parchment, ink, and various binding materials. Parchment, made from animal skins, was the predominant substrate, with calfskin, sheepskin, and goatskin being the most commonly used. The thickness of parchment varied, but typical sheets measured approximately 0.2 to 0.4 mm in thickness. The size of individual sheets often ranged from 10 to 15 inches in width and 12 to 18 inches in height, although larger formats were not uncommon, particularly in liturgical texts. Ink production also warrants attention, as it played a critical role in the visibility and durability of both text and marginalia. The most prevalent ink in the medieval period was carbon black, created through the burning of organic materials such as wood or bone. This ink was suspended in a solution of water and gum arabic, which served as a binder. The typical ratio of carbon black to binder was approximately 3 to 1 by weight, resulting in a viscous ink that adhered well to parchment. From the late 12th century onwards, iron gall ink began to gain popularity due to its permanence and darker hue, produced from the tannins in oak galls mixed with ferrous sulfate. The maintenance of these manuscripts was also a significant aspect of their life cycle. Manuscripts required careful storage to prevent deterioration. The ideal conditions for manuscript preservation included a relative humidity level of 40 to 60% and a temperature range of 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Manuscripts were often stored in wooden chests lined with felt to protect them from dust and humidity. The use of protective covers, typically made from leather or cloth, was also common practice to shield the manuscripts from environmental factors. Regular inspection and maintenance were necessary to ensure the longevity of manuscripts. This included checking for signs of insect damage, mold, and fading ink. The role of the conservator emerged in response to the need for maintenance, particularly from the 13th century onwards. Conservators were responsible for performing repairs, such as resewing loose folios or patching tears with strips of parchment. The cost of maintenance varied widely depending on the extent of the work required. Minor repairs could range from 1 to 2 denarii, while extensive restoration might exceed 10 denarii. Financial records pertaining to the production and maintenance of manuscripts provide insight into the economic considerations of medieval manuscript culture. The costs associated with manuscript creation typically included expenses for materials, labor, and sometimes even the commissioning of illustrations or marginalia. A survey of records from the late 14th century reveals that the average cost for a standard-sized liturgical manuscript could range from 5 to 30 shillings, depending on the complexity of the text and the presence of decorative elements. Personnel involved in the manuscript production process can be categorized into distinct roles, each contributing to the overall workflow. The scribe was responsible for the transcription of text, often working under the supervision of a master or head scribe. Scribes typically trained for several years, learning techniques for letter formation, spacing, and the application of various scripts, such as Carolingian minuscule or Gothic script. The average scribe could produce approximately 2 to 3 folios per day, translating to about 1 to 2 pages of text, depending on the intricacy of the script and the inclusion of illustrations. Illuminators, another essential role, specialized in the creation of decorative elements, including initial letters, borders, and marginal illustrations. The illuminator's work was often commissioned separately from that of the scribe, with costs for illumination typically ranging from 2 to 10 shillings per manuscript, depending on the detail and number of illustrations. The collaboration between scribes and illuminators was crucial, as the timing of their work often dictated the overall production schedule of the manuscript. Additionally, the role of the binder should not be overlooked. Binders were responsible for assembling the completed folios into a cohesive volume. This process included folding, sewing, and applying a cover, typically fashioned from leather or wooden boards. The average time taken for binding a manuscript was approximately 1 week, with costs varying based on the quality of materials used. A simple leather binding might cost around 3 shillings, while a more ornate binding could exceed 15 shillings. In terms of technical specifications, the standards for producing manuscripts were rigorously maintained to ensure uniformity and quality across different workshops. Manuscripts were typically organized into gatherings, or quires, each containing 4 to 8 folios. The standard quire size was generally 8 folios, folded in half, resulting in 16 pages. Folios were often numbered in the upper or lower corners to aid in assembly and referencing. The average number of pages in a complete manuscript could range from 100 to 300, though larger texts, such as Bibles or encyclopedias, could exceed 500 pages. The layout of the text and marginalia also adhered to specific conventions. The primary text was usually written within a designated area known as the text block, which measured approximately 6 to 8 inches in width and 8 to 10 inches in height, leaving margins of 1 to 3 inches on the sides. The inclusion of marginalia was subject to the approval process, which involved consultations with the head scribe or illuminator. The placement of marginalia was often dictated by the content of the adjacent text, with annotations, commentaries, or illustrations providing context or commentary. The approval processes for marginalia were often formalized within the manuscript production workflow. Typically, a proposed marginalia would be submitted to a review committee composed of senior scribes and theologians. This committee's responsibilities included evaluating the theological appropriateness, artistic merit, and textual relevance of the proposed marginalia. The review process could extend over several weeks, with approvals recorded in the manuscript's colophon, detailing the date and names of the approving parties. In conclusion, the study of construction methods and materials, maintenance procedures, financial records, personnel roles, and technical specifications surrounding medieval manuscripts reveals a complex system that underpinned the production and preservation of these works. The meticulous attention to detail and adherence to established practices reflect a deep-seated reverence for the written word in medieval society. Understanding these processes not only sheds light on the physical aspects of manuscript creation but also illuminates the broader cultural and intellectual milieu of the medieval period. The tedious history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes. Regional variations and comparisons. In exploring the intricate web of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes, one cannot overlook the significant regional variations that shape these practices. Across Europe, the traditions surrounding marginalia varied widely, influenced by local customs, cultural norms, and theological perspectives. In the British Isles, for instance, the approval process often involved ecclesiastical oversight, particularly within monastic communities. Scribes would submit their marginal notes for scrutiny to abbots or senior monks, who wielded considerable authority in determining the appropriateness and orthodoxy of the content. Conversely, in the southern regions of Europe, such as Italy and Spain, the approval processes were often less formalized, reflecting the burgeoning humanist movement and a growing emphasis on individual expression. In these areas, marginalia could sometimes serve as a vehicle for personal commentary, political satire, or even artistic expression, bypassing the stringent ecclesiastical oversight seen further north. The margins of manuscripts from this region are often adorned with vivid illustrations and playful annotations, indicative of a more liberal approach to the approval process. The stark contrast between northern and southern practices can be exemplified by the manuscript traditions emerging from the monastic centers of Cluny and Monte Cassino. While Cluny maintained a rigid framework for textual integrity, Monte Cassino's scribes often engaged in a more relaxed dialogue with the texts, resulting in lively marginalia that reflected local vernacular and contemporary issues. This divergence is further complicated by the influence of local dialects, which often dictated the style and substance of marginal notes, illustrating a broader cultural tapestry interwoven with the fabric of manuscript production. Evolution over different time periods. The evolution of marginalia approval processes also reflects the changing socio-political landscape of medieval Europe. During the early medieval period, the production of manuscripts was primarily the domain of monastic scribes, who adhered to strict guidelines set forth by their religious superiors. The initial centuries post-Charlemagne saw a focus on preserving classical texts and religious manuscripts, with marginalia primarily serving a didactic purpose. The approval process at this time was characterized by a communal approach, where the collective oversight of the monastic community ensured fidelity to the text. However, as the high medieval period progressed, the rise of universities and an increasingly literate laity began to shift the dynamics of manuscript production. By the 13th century, we observe a marked increase in the variety and volume of texts being produced, including not only religious works but also philosophical treatises and legal documents. This burgeoning intellectual environment led to a diversification of marginalia, with scholars and scribes experimenting with new forms of annotation. The approval process evolved accordingly, becoming more decentralized as local universities established their own standards for what constituted acceptable marginalia. By the late medieval period, particularly during the 15th century, the advent of the printing press heralded another transformation in the approval process. With the mass production of texts, the need for individual approval of marginal notes diminished. However, the legacy of the medieval manuscript tradition persisted. Marginal annotations became a popular means for readers to engage with printed works, albeit in a less regulated manner. The transition from manuscript to print illustrates a significant turning point in the marginalia approval process, showcasing the adaptability of these practices in response to technological advancements. Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The bureaucratic landscape of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes was often complex and multifaceted. Various ecclesiastical authorities and local governments issued edicts and regulations governing the production and annotation of manuscripts. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, although occurring in the early modern period, is illustrative of the long-standing desire for oversight in textual production, as it sought to address issues of orthodoxy and censorship that had been developing for centuries. In addition, many local jurisdictions enacted their own laws pertaining to manuscript production. For instance, in 13th-century Paris, the University of Paris established a set of guidelines for the approval of marginalia, which emphasized the need for annotations to align with the theological doctrines espoused by the Church. Manuscripts produced within the university's jurisdiction were required to undergo a rigorous vetting process, ensuring that any marginal notes conformed to the prevailing scholastic standards. Moreover, the role of the censor emerged as a vital component of the marginalia approval process. Censors, often appointed by ecclesiastical authorities, were tasked with reviewing manuscripts for heretical content or inappropriate marginalia. These officials maintained meticulous records of their findings and decisions, creating a bureaucratic apparatus that sought to navigate the delicate balance between intellectual freedom and doctrinal purity. The censor's work, while often perceived as oppressive, reflects the broader tensions inherent in the medieval textual landscape, tensions that would only intensify with the advent of the Reformation. Supply chain and logistics. The production of manuscripts, and consequently the marginalia that accompanied them, necessitated a well-developed supply chain and logistical framework. The creation of a single manuscript involved a multitude of components, including parchment, ink, and various writing instruments. The sourcing of high-quality parchment, in particular, presented significant challenges. Parchment was primarily derived from animal hides, and the procurement process could be laborious and time-consuming. Scribes often relied on local tanners and parchment makers, whose availability and skills directly influenced the quality of the manuscripts produced. In addition to parchment, the ink used in marginalia varied considerably based on regional availability and the preferences of individual scribes. Iron gall ink, for instance, was widely used due to its rich black hue and permanence, but its production involved a complex process that required specific natural ingredients. The scarcity of these materials could lead to significant delays in manuscript production, underscoring the importance of a reliable supply chain. The logistics of manuscript production also extended to the transportation of completed works. Manuscripts often traveled significant distances to reach their intended audiences, whether they were destined for monastic libraries, royal courts, or universities. The role of scribes as both creators and couriers cannot be overstated. Many scribes would personally oversee the delivery of their works, ensuring that the marginalia were preserved in transit. The establishment of trade routes and networks of communication facilitated this process, enabling manuscripts to circulate more freely across geographical boundaries. The interplay between supply chain dynamics and logistical considerations highlights the economic dimensions of manuscript production. The demand for manuscripts, and the marginalia therein, created a vibrant market that engaged various trades, from parchment makers to ink suppliers. The intricate relationships among these stakeholders contributed to the overall complexity of the approval processes surrounding marginalia, illustrating how economic factors intertwined with cultural practices in the medieval period. Record-keeping methods. Finally, the methods employed in record-keeping regarding manuscript marginalia approval processes warrant examination. The meticulous documentation of marginalia was essential for several reasons. It provided a means of accountability, facilitated the tracking of censorship, and fostered a culture of scholarly dialogue. Monastic communities often maintain detailed records of manuscripts produced within their walls, including registers that catalog the content, authorship, and approval status of each work. The use of notarial records became increasingly prevalent as the bureaucratic apparatus surrounding manuscript production expanded. Notaries played a crucial role in documenting the approval processes, often recording the names of censors, the dates of approval, and any annotations made in the margins. These records served as vital evidence of compliance with ecclesiastical standards, ensuring that manuscripts could be defended against accusations of heresy or impropriety. Moreover, the advent of the codex format facilitated more efficient record-keeping, allowing for the inclusion of indices and tables of contents that referenced marginalia. Scribes began to experiment with various systems of organization, employing systems such as rubrication, wherein titles and headings were written in red ink, to highlight important annotations. The evolution of these record-keeping methods reflects an increasing sophistication in the handling of marginalia, as scribes sought to navigate the complexities of textual production while adhering to the ever-evolving standards of approval. In conclusion, the history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes is a tapestry woven from regional variations, changing time periods, bureaucratic regulations, supply chain considerations, and meticulous record-keeping methods. Each thread contributes to our understanding of the intricate dynamics that shaped the production and reception of manuscripts during this era. While the topic may seem tedious at first glance, the depth and complexity of these processes reveal the profound impact of marginalia on the medieval intellectual landscape. The history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes is, at its core, a labyrinthine exploration through time, geography, and regulatory frameworks. Within this dense tapestry, regional variations and comparisons emerge as pivotal components in understanding how marginalia, those often whimsical, bizarre, and enlightening illustrations and notes found in the margins of manuscripts, were received and regulated across different locales. The evolution of these practices over time, alongside bureaucratic regulations and laws, underlines the complexity of this scholarly endeavor. Furthermore, the logistics of supply chains and record-keeping methods provide a granular perspective on the minutiae that shaped these historical processes. #Regional variations and comparisons. The geographical distribution of manuscript production during the medieval period reveals stark contrasts in the approval processes for marginalia. For instance, in the British Isles, particularly during the 12th and 13th centuries, monastic scribes were often granted considerable latitude in their creativity. The vibrant marginalia of the Lindisfarne Gospels, with its intricate designs and iconography, exemplifies a region where the approval process favored artistic expression. In contrast, the approval processes in regions like the Holy Roman Empire were significantly more circumscribed, emphasizing doctrinal adherence and uniformity. Here, the marginalia often served as didactic tools meant to reinforce theological concepts rather than as a canvas for individual creativity. In the Iberian Peninsula, regional variations became particularly pronounced during the Reconquista. Manuscripts produced in Muslim-controlled territories showcased a blend of Islamic artistry and Christian themes, leading to a unique approval process that necessitated the collaboration of scholars from different cultural backgrounds. The resulting marginalia often reflected the vibrant cross-pollination of ideas, but the approval processes tended to be more convoluted, reflecting the tensions of the time. Moreover, in Italy, the flourishing of humanism during the late medieval period heralded a shift in the approach to marginalia. The approval processes here began to incorporate more secular considerations, allowing for a broader range of subjects in the margins. The emergence of the printing press in the 15th century further transformed these practices, as the once painstakingly handmade manuscripts began to incorporate standardized approaches to marginalia that were more aligned with the burgeoning market for literature. #Evolution over different time periods. As we trace the evolution of marginalia approval processes through the medieval period, we observe a gradual transformation influenced by socio-political and cultural dynamics. In the early Middle Ages, from roughly 500 to 1000 CE, the approval processes were largely informal. Monastic communities operated under the auspices of local abbots and bishops, whose discretion governed the inclusion of marginalia. This era was characterized by a singular focus on preserving religious texts, resulting in minimal marginal commentary beyond the essential glosses necessary for elucidating scriptural meanings. As we transition into the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300 CE, we begin to see a marked increase in the complexity of the marginalia approval processes. The rise of universities and the establishment of scholasticism introduced a more systematic approach to text interpretation. Scholars began to seek approval for their notes and illustrations, often submitting their work to local authorities for scrutiny. This era saw the emergence of formalized ecclesiastical councils that would set guidelines for what constituted acceptable marginalia, with a particular emphasis on theological accuracy and orthodoxy. By the late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500 CE, the approval processes had further evolved, reflecting the socio-political upheaval of the time. The rise of the merchant class and the increasing importance of lay patrons introduced new dynamics in the creation and approval of marginalia. Manuscripts began to cater to broader audiences, and thus the approval processes became more diverse. The marginalia could now include not only theological commentary but also secular anecdotes, humor, and even political satire. However, this diversification did not come without contention. As the boundaries of acceptable marginalia expanded, so too did the scrutiny from ecclesiastical authorities concerned with maintaining doctrinal purity. #Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The bureaucratic regulations governing the approval of marginalia were often convoluted and, at times, absurdly tedious. In many regions, local bishops issued decrees that outlined the parameters of what was permissible in the margins of sacred texts. These regulations were often couched in the language of piety and orthodoxy, emphasizing the need for marginalia to serve the greater good of the faith. For example, a common stipulation would mandate that any illustrations must not detract from the sacred text but rather enhance the reader's understanding of the divine message. In some instances, specific laws were enacted that directly impacted the creation of marginalia. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, although post-medieval, serves as an illustrative example of how these regulations could retroactively affect previously crafted manuscripts. The Council's decrees mandated stricter adherence to orthodox interpretations of Scripture, thereby invalidating numerous marginal notes that had previously been considered acceptable. Such regulatory frameworks often created a climate of fear among scribes, who were acutely aware that their creative endeavors could lead to censure or worse. Furthermore, the complexities of these bureaucratic regulations were compounded by the varying interpretations of the laws across different regions. In France, for instance, the centralization of authority under the monarchy led to a more uniform approach to marginalia approval, while in fragmented regions like the German principalities, local customs often dictated more lenient or idiosyncratic practices. Supply chain and logistics. The supply chain and logistics surrounding the production of manuscripts and their accompanying marginalia approval processes were, in themselves, a study in medieval commerce and craftsmanship. The creation of a manuscript was an intricate operation involving multiple actors, including scribes, illuminators, and overseers. Each of these roles required specific skills and materials, and the logistical coordination of these elements was essential to the timely completion of any manuscript. Scribes often relied on local markets for their materials, including parchment, quills, and inks. The sourcing of high-quality parchment, in particular, was a meticulous process, as the best manuscripts were made from calfskin, which was both costly and labor-intensive to produce. In regions where livestock was plentiful, such as the English countryside, the supply chain was relatively straightforward. However, in areas where resources were scarce, such as the mountainous regions of Central Europe, obtaining quality materials could become a logistical nightmare, often necessitating trade agreements or the establishment of trade routes. The logistics of manuscript production were further complicated by the need for oversight in the approval process. Scribes and illuminators often had to wait for the approval of their marginalia from ecclesiastical authorities before they could proceed with their work. This waiting period could stretch for weeks or even months, particularly if the manuscripts were part of larger commissions that required extensive review. The resulting delays not only affected the workflow of individual scribes but also had broader implications for the local book trade, which was still developing as a significant economic sector during the later medieval period. Record-keeping methods. Record-keeping in the context of marginalia approval processes was crucial for maintaining a historical record of what was deemed acceptable within the margins of manuscripts. Various methodologies were employed throughout the medieval period, ranging from simple annotations in the margins of regulatory texts to meticulously organized ledgers that documented each manuscript's approval process. In monastic settings, record-keeping often took the form of detailed inventories listing the texts produced, the names of the scribes, and the specific approvals granted for marginalia. Monks would maintain these records in what were known as cartularies, which served as repositories for important documents and decisions made by the monastic community. The act of recording approvals was not merely bureaucratic, it was seen as a sacred duty, ensuring that the integrity of the texts was preserved for future generations. In contrast, secular workshops often employed less formal methods of record-keeping, relying more on oral traditions and communal knowledge. This lack of formal documentation could lead to inconsistencies in the approval processes, as the criteria for what constituted acceptable marginalia could vary widely based on individual artisans' interpretations and local customs. The implications of these divergent practices were significant, as they contributed to the regional variations in marginalia that we observe today. Conclusion. The intricate history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes is a profound reflection of the complexities of medieval society. Regional variations, the evolution of practices over time, the intricacies of bureaucratic regulations, the logistics of supply chains, and the methods of record-keeping all intertwine to form a dense web of scholarly activity that reveals much about the intellectual currents of the medieval world. As we peel back the layers of this tedious history, it becomes evident that marginalia was not merely an afterthought but a vital component of the manuscript tradition, embodying the creative spirit and the regulatory frameworks of a bygone era. In summary, the narrative of marginalia approval processes serves as a lens through which we can better understand the broader context of medieval scholarship, art, and society. The resulting tapestry, while tedious, is rich with details that speak to the human endeavor to find meaning and expression in the margins of history. The Tedious History of Medieval Manuscript Marginalia Approval Processes, Parts 8-12. Part 8, Regional Variations and Comparisons. As we delve deeper into the annals of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes, it becomes increasingly evident that regional variations played a significant role in shaping the bureaucratic landscape of this particular scholarly endeavor. The geographical distinctions between regions such as northern France, southern Italy, and the British Isles were not merely incidental, they significantly influenced the character and nature of marginalia, as well as the protocols surrounding their approval. In northern France, particularly in the regions of Picardy and Champagne, the approval process for marginalia was characterized by a more centralized bureaucratic structure, owing in part to the influence of the burgeoning university system in Paris. Here, the presence of influential clerics and scholars resulted in a more standardized approach to the creation and approval of marginal notes. Scribes operating in this milieu often adhered to a prescribed set of guidelines, which mandated the inclusion of specific types of marginalia, such as glosses, commentaries, and illustrations, that conformed to the expectations of the Parisian intellectual elite. Conversely, in southern Italy, particularly in the regions surrounding Naples and Salerno, the approval process for marginalia was markedly less formalized. The rich tapestry of cultural influences, stemming from Byzantine, Arab, and local traditions, resulted in a more eclectic approach to marginalia. Manuscripts produced in this region frequently featured a diverse array of marginal annotations, ranging from theological reflections to whimsical illustrations of everyday life. Approval processes were often informal, relying heavily on the discretion of individual scribes and their patrons. This variance underscores the necessity of context when evaluating the nature and significance of marginalia across different regions. In the British Isles, a further layer of complexity emerges, particularly in the context of monastic scriptoria. The approval process in English monasteries, such as those located in Canterbury and York, often involved a communal approach. Manuscripts were typically produced collaboratively, with multiple scribes contributing to a single text. As a result, the approval of marginalia was often debated among the monks, leading to a rich interplay of ideas and interpretations that mirrored the theological discussions of the period. The regional variations in approval processes highlight the dynamic nature of medieval scholarship and the myriad influences that shaped the creation of marginalia. Part 9: Evolution over different time periods. Turning our attention to the evolution of marginalia approval processes over different time periods, it becomes apparent that these protocols were subject to change in response to broader historical and cultural shifts. Beginning in the early medieval period, circa 500–1000 CE, the creation of manuscript marginalia was largely unregulated, with scribes enjoying significant autonomy in the annotations they produced. During this period, marginalia often served as a means of personal expression, reflecting the individual scribe's thoughts and interpretations of the text. The advent of the Carolingian Renaissance in the late 8th and early 9th centuries marked a shift in the landscape of manuscript production. The establishment of standardized scripts and the promotion of literacy by Charlemagne's court led to a more organized approach to marginalia. Scribes began to adhere to specific guidelines that dictated the types of annotations that could be included. This period also saw the rise of glossed texts, wherein marginalia were employed to explicate difficult passages, reflecting an emerging emphasis on clarity and comprehension. The High Middle Ages, circa 1000 to 1300 CE, witnessed a further evolution in the approval processes of marginalia, coinciding with the flourishing of universities across Europe. The proliferation of educational institutions necessitated the development of more formalized review processes, as scholars sought to ensure the accuracy and appropriateness of the marginal notes accompanying their texts. The emergence of the scholastic method during this period resulted in a heightened focus on logic and dialectical reasoning, which, in turn, influenced the nature of marginalia. Annotators were increasingly tasked with providing not just commentary, but also critical examinations of texts, leading to a more rigorous and structured approach to the approval of marginal annotations. The late medieval period, circa 1300 to 1500 CE, introduced yet another layer of complexity to the approval processes surrounding marginalia. The advent of the printing press in the 15th century heralded a significant shift in the production and dissemination of texts, which, in turn, affected the creation of marginalia. While manuscript production continued, the rise of printed materials led to a decline in the traditional marginalia approval processes. The democratization of knowledge facilitated by the printing press diminished the role of the scribe as the gatekeeper of textual interpretation. Nevertheless, the tradition of marginalia persisted in printed texts, albeit in a different form, leading to a fusion of manuscript and print cultures. Part 10: Bureaucratic Regulations and Laws. The bureaucratic regulations and laws governing the approval of marginalia were often convoluted and multifaceted, reflecting the complexities of medieval governance and ecclesiastical authority. In regions where the Church held significant sway, such as in the Papal States and parts of Germany, the approval processes for marginalia were often intertwined with ecclesiastical regulations. The Church's desire to maintain orthodoxy and prevent heretical interpretations necessitated the establishment of stringent guidelines concerning the content of marginal annotations. One notable example of bureaucratic regulation is the decrees issued by various councils, such as the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which sought to codify the standards for theological writings. These decrees often included stipulations regarding the nature of marginalia, with particular emphasis placed on prohibiting annotations that might lead to misinterpretation of sacred texts. Scribes and scholars found themselves navigating a labyrinthine landscape of ecclesiastical bureaucracy, wherein the approval of marginalia often required endorsement from local bishops or theological faculties, further complicating the already intricate processes. In addition to ecclesiastical regulations, secular laws also played a role in shaping the approval of marginalia. The rise of centralized monarchies in the later medieval period led to the establishment of legal frameworks governing manuscript production. These laws often mandated the registration of manuscripts with local authorities, which included stipulations for the approval of marginalia. The interplay between ecclesiastical and secular regulations created a complex web of oversight that scribes and scholars had to navigate, often leading to tensions between religious and civil authorities concerning the appropriateness of certain annotations. Part 11: Supply Chain and Logistics. The logistical considerations surrounding the production and approval of marginalia were often overlooked in scholarly discourse, yet they are critical to understanding the broader context of manuscript creation. The supply chain for manuscript production was a complex network involving the procurement of materials, the labor of scribes, and the dissemination of texts. The primary materials required for manuscript production included parchment, ink, and writing instruments, each of which was sourced from different suppliers, often necessitating intricate logistical arrangements. Parchment, for instance, was typically produced from animal hides, with the quality of the parchment varying based on several factors, including the animal's breed and the method of preparation. The demand for high-quality parchment led to the establishment of specialized suppliers, often located in rural areas where livestock farming was prevalent. These suppliers would engage in the careful selection and treatment of hides, ensuring that the final product met the standards expected by meticulous scribes. Ink production was another critical aspect of the supply chain. The inks used in manuscript production were typically made from natural materials, including carbon black and tannins, which required skilled artisans to blend and prepare. The availability of these materials could fluctuate based on regional factors, such as trade routes and local agricultural practices, leading to potential delays in manuscript production. Scribes often found themselves at the mercy of these external factors, which could impact the timely approval of marginalia. Furthermore, the logistics of manuscript dissemination were equally complex. Once a manuscript was completed and approved, it often needed to be transported to various locations for distribution. This process involved careful planning and coordination, as manuscripts were typically transported by couriers or merchants who specialized in the trade of books. The routes taken for transportation were often fraught with challenges, including geographical obstacles and the threat of banditry. Scribes and scholars had to consider these logistical challenges when determining the timeline for the approval of marginalia, as delays in transportation could lead to missed opportunities for scholarly exchange. Part 12: Record-Keeping Methods. The record-keeping methods employed in the medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes reveal a great deal about the bureaucratic nature of these undertakings. The meticulous documentation of approvals, annotations, and the provenance of manuscripts was essential for maintaining transparency and accountability in the approval process. Various methods were employed to keep records, including the use of registers, ledgers, and chronicles. In many monastic scriptoria, scribes maintained registers that documented the production and approval of manuscripts. These registers often included detailed entries regarding the titles of manuscripts, the names of scribes, the dates of completion, and the individuals responsible for approving the marginalia. This meticulous record-keeping served not only as a means of tracking production but also played a crucial role in establishing the authenticity and credibility of manuscripts, an essential consideration in a world where textual integrity was paramount. In addition to registers, ledgers were utilized to maintain accounts of materials procurement and labor expenses associated with manuscript production. These ledgers provided a comprehensive overview of the costs involved in producing a manuscript, including expenditures on parchment, ink, and labor. The careful accounting of these costs was critical for monastic communities, as it ensured the sustainability of their manuscript production efforts. Chronicles, often compiled by monks or scribes, served as a narrative account of significant events within the scriptorium, including milestones in the approval of marginalia. These chronicles provided a historical record of the intellectual endeavors undertaken within the monastic community, documenting the evolution of marginalia approval processes over time. The existence of such chronicles speaks to the broader societal value placed on record-keeping and the desire for historical continuity in an era characterized by rapid change. In summary, The approval processes for medieval manuscript marginalia were marked by a rich tapestry of regional variations, historical evolution, bureaucratic regulations, logistical challenges, and meticulous record-keeping practices. The complexities inherent in these processes underscore the significance of marginalia not only as a means of textual annotation but also as a reflection of the broader intellectual and cultural currents of the medieval period. As we continue to explore the nuances of this subject, it becomes increasingly clear that the history of marginalia approval processes is as intricate and multifaceted as the texts themselves. The exploration of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes has revealed a labyrinth of intricacies, notably when one considers the regional variations and comparisons that emerged across the vast expanse of medieval Europe. Each locale, steeped in its own cultural milieu, contributed distinct practices and methodologies to the marginalia approval processes, resulting in a rich tapestry of textual embellishments that often reflected local customs, societal hierarchies, and ecclesiastical influences. Regional variations and comparisons. In the British Isles, for instance, the practice of marginalia was heavily influenced by the monastic tradition, particularly in the context of the Benedictine order. Monastic scribes, operating under strict guidelines and ecclesiastical scrutiny, developed a unique system of marginalia that often included annotative commentary aimed at elucidating theological concepts or providing scriptural cross-references. The approval of such marginalia would typically necessitate the endorsement of an abbot or a designated monastic overseer, whose role was to ensure that the annotations adhered to the doctrinal standards of the Church. Contrastingly, in the Iberian Peninsula, particularly within the realms of Castile and Aragon, the emergence of secular manuscript culture during the late medieval period fostered a different approach to marginalia. Here, the influence of Islamic scholarship and the coexistence of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities led to a vibrant exchange of ideas, resulting in marginalia that often blended linguistic traditions and cultural motifs. The approval processes in these regions were less formalized compared to their British counterparts, often relying on communal consensus or the informal endorsements of learned individuals rather than institutionalized oversight. In the Germanic regions, the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire resulted in a patchwork of practices. In the Northern Territories, where the influence of the Hanseatic League was pronounced, marginalia began to take on commercial significance, often serving as a means of branding or personalizing manuscripts for sale in burgeoning marketplaces. The approval of such marginalia often fell under the purview of guild regulations, wherein master scribes would vouch for the quality and appropriateness of the annotations before a manuscript could be circulated. Evolution over different time periods. The evolution of marginalia approval processes is inherently tied to the broader socio-political and technological changes that characterized the medieval period. Initially, during the early medieval era, marginalia were predominantly oral in nature, with annotations being made by learned individuals who were often the sole bearers of textual knowledge. The advent of the Carolingian Renaissance in the 9th century marked a pivotal shift as the establishment of scriptoria led to a more systematic approach to manuscript production, including the formalization of marginalia approval processes. As the High Medieval period unfolded, the establishment of universities and the rise of the scholastic method introduced a new layer of complexity to the approval processes. Textual criticism and the emphasis on scholastic disputation necessitated a more rigorous vetting of marginalia, as annotations began to serve not only as explanatory notes but also as points of contention in academic discourse. The role of the master in this context became paramount, with scribes often required to present their marginalia for review before a cohort of scholars, who would engage in deliberation over the merits and drawbacks of each annotation. By the late medieval period, the emergence of the printing press heralded a significant transformation in the context of marginalia. The proliferation of printed texts rendered the traditional manuscript approval processes increasingly obsolete, as the speed and volume of production outpaced the bureaucratic frameworks that had previously governed marginalia. However, even in this new landscape, the vestiges of approval processes remained, as printers sought to maintain a semblance of quality control through the establishment of editorial boards tasked with reviewing marginalia prior to publication. Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The bureaucratic regulations governing marginalia approval processes were often as convoluted as the annotations themselves. In various regions, ecclesiastical authorities established comprehensive statutes dictating the permissible content and form of marginalia. For instance, in England, the 1215 Fourth Lateran Council imposed stringent regulations on the production of illuminated manuscripts, resulting in a codification of marginalia standards that sought to curb the excesses of scribal creativity. These regulations mandated that marginalia not only be theologically sound but also that they adhered to specific aesthetic guidelines, ensuring that the visual harmony of the manuscript was maintained. In France, the burgeoning influence of the royal court during the 14th century led to the enactment of laws that sought to regulate the production and sale of manuscripts. The Ordonnance de 1345 explicitly addressed the approval processes for marginalia, stipulating that any annotations deemed heretical or seditious would result in the confiscation of the manuscript and possible legal repercussions for the scribe. The ramifications of such laws instilled a sense of caution among scribes, who often found themselves navigating a treacherous landscape of artistic expression and legal compliance. The bureaucratic apparatus surrounding marginalia approval also extended to the establishment of guilds and associations. In cities such as Paris and Florence, the formation of scribal guilds resulted in the development of internal regulations governing the production of manuscripts, including the approval of marginalia. These guilds operated with a degree of autonomy, yet their regulations often mirrored the broader ecclesiastical and secular laws of the time, resulting in a complex interplay of authority that shaped marginalia practices. Supply chain and logistics. The logistics of manuscript production, including the approval of marginalia, entailed a multifaceted supply chain that encompassed various materials and labor forces. The process began with the procurement of high-quality parchment or vellum, which was often sourced from specialized tanneries that catered specifically to the demands of manuscript production. The quality of the writing surface had a direct impact on the legibility and aesthetic appeal of both the main text and the marginalia, necessitating a careful selection process. Once the materials were secured, the role of the scribe came to the forefront. Scribes often operated within a structured workshop environment, where they collaborated with illuminators and binders to create a cohesive product. The interplay between these various roles was essential to the approval processes, as scribes would often consult with illuminators regarding the placement of marginalia, ensuring that the annotations complemented the visual elements of the manuscript. The logistics of ink production also played a crucial role in the approval of marginalia. The formulation of ink involved a meticulous process of sourcing ingredients such as carbon black, tannin, and gum arabic, each of which contributed to the final product's consistency and durability. The ink's formulation was subject to the approval of the workshop master, who would often insist on consistency in color and composition to maintain the integrity of the manuscript. Furthermore, the consideration of logistics extended to the distribution of manuscripts once completed. The burgeoning trade networks of the late medieval period facilitated the movement of manuscripts across regional borders, often necessitating the establishment of transport routes and the hiring of couriers. The approval processes for marginalia in this context would occasionally involve the endorsement of local authorities, who sought to ensure that the manuscripts being circulated conformed to regional standards of content and quality. Record-keeping methods. The meticulous record-keeping methods employed in the context of marginalia approval processes reveal a fascinating dimension of medieval manuscript culture. Scribes often maintained detailed logs of their work, documenting not only the texts they produced but also the annotations that accompanied them. These records served as a means of accountability, allowing scribes to track the approval status of marginalia and ensuring that they adhered to the established guidelines set forth by ecclesiastical and secular authorities. In some instances, the practice of keeping record books extended to the marginalia themselves. Scribes would create indices or glossaries of approved marginalia, cataloging the various annotations that had received ecclesiastical or guild approval. This practice not only facilitated the approval process but also served as a reference for future scribes, establishing a continuity of thought and interpretation across generations. Additionally, the advent of the printing press necessitated a re-evaluation of record-keeping methods. Printing houses began to implement more formalized systems of documentation, employing ledgers that detailed the titles, authors, and approval statuses of printed works. The marginalia associated with these texts were similarly catalogued, establishing a new paradigm in which approval processes were no longer solely the purview of individual scribes but became integrated into the broader business practices of the burgeoning publishing industry. In conclusion, the tedious history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes is characterized by a kaleidoscope of regional variations, evolving practices, bureaucratic regulations, logistical complexities, and meticulous record-keeping methods. Each of these elements contributed to a rich tapestry of textual culture that reflects the intricate interplay between creativity, authority, and commerce during a pivotal period in European history. The study of marginalia approval processes, while ostensibly mundane, reveals the profound significance of these annotations in shaping the intellectual and cultural landscape of the medieval world. The tedious history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes has been a subject of fascination for scholars who find themselves ensnared in the labyrinthine intricacies of medieval text production. As we delve into regional variations and comparisons, The evolution over different time periods, bureaucratic regulations and laws, supply chain and logistics, and record-keeping methods, we must remain acutely aware of the minutiae that characterize this historical narrative. ##### Regional variations and comparisons. The medieval landscape of manuscript production was not a monolithic entity, rather, it was a tapestry woven from the diverse threads of regional practices and cultural influences. In England, for instance, the approval processes for marginalia were often overseen by ecclesiastical authorities, particularly in monastic settings. The monasteries of Canterbury and York demonstrated distinct preferences in their marginalia, often leaning towards theological commentary and moralistic reflections. Conversely, in the southern regions of France, particularly in the scriptorium of Saint Denis, the approval for marginalia involved a more secular oversight, reflecting the burgeoning influence of courtly culture and the rise of the vernacular. In the Iberian Peninsula, the interplay between Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholarly traditions led to a unique blending of marginalia approval processes. The presence of Jewish scholars in Christian monasteries, particularly during the Reconquista, resulted in a fascinating exchange of ideas that influenced the nature of marginalia. The approval processes in this region often involved a collaborative effort, where manuscript illuminators would seek the approval of both Christian and Jewish authorities to ensure the marginalia were tasteful and non-offensive to diverse religious sensibilities. In the northern regions, such as Scandinavia and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the marginalia approval processes were less formalized. Manuscripts produced in these areas often bore the marks of local dialects and cultural practices, with little regulation governing the content. The marginal notes in these texts were frequently personal reflections, local lore, and even humorous jibes, reflecting a more laissez-faire attitude towards marginalia than that observed in the more structured environments of Southern Europe. ####evolution over different time periods. The evolution of the marginalia approval processes is closely tied to the broader historical developments of the medieval period. In the early Middle Ages, particularly during the 6th to 9th centuries, the production of manuscripts was primarily carried out in monastic settings. Marginalia during this period were often limited to simple annotations or corrections, serving more as aids for the monks who read and copied the texts. The approval processes for these marginal notes were rudimentary at best, characterized by an informal consensus among the scribes within a given monastery. However, with the advent of the Carolingian Renaissance in the late 8th century, there was a significant shift in the approach to manuscript production and, consequently, the approval processes for marginalia. The introduction of standardized scripts, such as Carolingian minuscule, necessitated a more systematic method of oversight. Monastic reformers, such as Charlemagne, emphasized the importance of clarity and accuracy in texts, leading to a heightened scrutiny of marginalia. This period saw the establishment of guidelines for what constituted appropriate marginalia, often dictated by a desire to maintain theological orthodoxy and textual integrity. As we progressed into the High Middle Ages, approximately from the 12th to the 15th centuries, the approval processes became increasingly bureaucratic. The burgeoning rise of universities, particularly in Paris and Bologna, introduced a new layer of complexity. Scholars began to view marginalia as a means of engaging with the text, rather than merely annotating it. The approval processes evolved to involve a more formalized method of evaluation, with faculty committees or academic councils assessing the appropriateness of marginal notes before a manuscript could be deemed suitable for circulation. This period marked a transition from monastic oversight to an academic one, reflecting the changing landscape of knowledge production and dissemination. The late medieval period, particularly the 15th century, saw the advent of the printing press, which fundamentally altered the dynamics of manuscript production and approval processes. With the mass production of texts, the role of marginalia shifted again. The approval processes for marginalia became less about individual manuscripts and more about typographical conventions. Printers began to establish their own standards for marginal notes, leading to a standardization that had previously been absent. This shift not only democratized access to texts but also diluted the personal touch that characterized earlier manuscript marginalia. #Bureaucratic regulations and laws. The bureaucratic regulations governing marginalia approval processes varied significantly across regions and time periods. In regions with strong ecclesiastical authority, such as the Papal States, strict laws were enacted to regulate the content of marginalia. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, established by the Catholic Church in the late 16th century, was a significant manifestation of such regulatory efforts, although it postdates our primary focus. Nevertheless, the roots of such censorship can be traced back to earlier medieval regulations. In England, the Synod of Whitby in 664 established early ecclesiastical guidelines that inadvertently influenced marginalia approval processes. The regulations set forth at this synod emphasized the importance of orthodoxy in religious texts, which extended to the marginalia that accompanied them. Monastic leaders were tasked with ensuring that any annotations did not undermine the theological teachings of the Church. Furthermore, the establishment of the Archbishop of Canterbury's authority meant that marginalia approval often required the express consent of ecclesiastical hierarchies. In contrast, the regulatory landscape in the Holy Roman Empire was more decentralized. The myriad principalities and duchies possessed their own sets of laws and regulations governing manuscript production. The city of Nuremberg, for instance, became a hub of manuscript production where local guilds established their own codes of conduct. These guild regulations often included stipulations regarding the content of marginalia, requiring scribes to submit samples for approval to ensure compliance with local standards. Supply chain and logistics. The logistics involved in the approval process of marginalia cannot be overstated. Manuscript production in the medieval period was not merely an isolated act of writing, it was an intricate supply chain that involved various stakeholders, each contributing to the final product. The process began with the sourcing of materials, primarily parchment or vellum, which were often procured from local tanneries. The quality of these materials significantly influenced the final manuscript's durability and, consequently, its approval for circulation. The role of the scribe, often a specialized artisan, was pivotal in this supply chain. Scribes were not only responsible for the transcription of texts but also for the meticulous placement of marginalia. As the approval processes evolved, scribes began to collaborate with illuminators and artists, leading to a more integrated approach to manuscript production. This collaboration often necessitated a logistical coordination that could involve the transportation of manuscripts between different workshops, particularly in urban centers where multiple artisans worked in tandem. Moreover, the distribution of manuscripts was heavily reliant on trade routes. The burgeoning commerce of the late medieval period facilitated the movement of texts across regions, creating a demand for approved marginalia that could appeal to diverse audiences. The rise of fairs and marketplaces as centers for the sale of manuscripts further complicated the logistics of approval, as merchants sought to ensure that the marginalia met the expectations of their clientele. ###record-keeping methods. The record-keeping methods employed in the approval processes of marginalia were as diverse as the regions themselves. In monastic settings, meticulous records were often maintained in the form of catalogues listing the texts produced within a given scriptorium. These records frequently included annotations regarding the approval status of marginalia, allowing for a transparent overview of what was deemed acceptable. In contrast, secular workshops often employed less formal methods of record-keeping. The rise of notaries and clerks in urban centers during the late Middle Ages led to the establishment of more systematic documentation practices. Manuscript producers in these environments often kept ledger books that recorded not only the texts produced but also the specific marginal notes approved for each piece. These records provided a wealth of information regarding popular themes and styles of marginalia, as well as insights into the approval processes that governed them. The introduction of the printing press further transformed record-keeping methods. Printers began to adopt standardized forms of documentation, leading to the creation of printers' colophons that often included notes about marginalia. These colophons became a form of advertisement that assured potential buyers of the quality of the text and the appropriateness of its marginalia. In conclusion, the multifaceted history of the approval processes for medieval manuscript marginalia reveals a complex interplay of regional variations, evolving practices, bureaucratic regulations, logistical challenges, and record-keeping methods. Each aspect, seemingly mundane in its own right, contributes to a broader understanding of the cultural and intellectual landscape of the medieval period. As we reflect on these intricate details, we are reminded of the importance of marginalia as both a textual phenomenon and a reflection of the society in which it was produced. ###The tedious history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes. ###Introduction. The history of marginalia in medieval manuscripts is a fascinating yet often overlooked aspect of textual production and manuscript culture. While the grand narratives of illuminated texts and the meticulous art of calligraphy tend to dominate scholarly discourse, the quieter yet equally significant process of marginalia approval remains shrouded in layers of complexity. This intricate web of approval processes, involving minor historical figures, case studies, comparative analyses, archaeological findings, and hypothetical primary source quotations, merits a thorough examination. Minor historical figures and their roles. To understand the landscape of marginalia approval, we must first consider the roles of minor historical figures who influenced the processes, albeit in ways that may not have garnered widespread recognition. Among these figures, the role of the scribe stands out. Scribes were responsible for copying texts and were often the first line of defense in the approval process for marginalia. One such notable scribe, Alberic of Renault, worked in a scriptorium in the early 12th century. His meticulous attention to detail ensured that the marginal notes made by various scholars were either preserved or omitted based on a set of informal criteria. In 1137, Alberic penned a treatise titled On the Nature of Marginalia, where he outlined what he deemed acceptable forms of commentary. He emphasized the importance of clarity and relevance, stating, "Marginalia should not only illuminate the text but also reflect a harmony of thought befitting the work's sanctity." His perspective, while not widely circulated, influenced the practices of subsequent scribes who sought to uphold similar standards. Another significant but lesser-known figure was Eldred of Lotharingia, a monk and manuscript editor in the late 11th century. Eldred took it upon himself to create a system of approval for marginalia that involved a council of monks. This council would convene biannually to review the marginal notes added by various scribes. Their deliberations often involved lengthy discussions, sometimes lasting several days, as they debated the merit of each annotation. Eldred's council established criteria that could be summarized as the 3 pillars of marginalia approval: relevance, readability, and theological alignment. Specific case studies with dates. To further illustrate the approval processes surrounding marginalia, we can delve into specific case studies. One of the most notable examples is the manuscript known as the Codex Luminus, created in a scriptorium in Canterbury around 1150. This codex contained various theological texts, and its margins were rife with annotations made by different scholars over time. The approval process for the marginalia of the Codex Luminus was particularly rigorous due to its intended use as a teaching tool for novice monks. In 1155, a debate arose regarding a particular marginal note added by a scribe named Gervas the Younger, which read, "This text is akin to the wisdom of Solomon." The Council of Monks, led by Eldred, convened to assess the validity of this comment. After 2 days of heated discussion, the council ultimately decided to retain the note, justifying their choice with the rationale that it provided a valuable interpretative insight, even though it lacked direct textual references. Another case study is the Book of Hours of St. Albans, produced around 1190. This manuscript underwent a unique approval process led by a group of nuns who contributed marginalia from their perspectives. One particularly contentious annotation, a commentary on the Psalms by Sister Agnes, read, "Herein lies the lament of the soul, akin to a swan's song." The abbess, upon reviewing this note in 1193, deemed it too poetic and not sufficiently doctrinal, leading to a decision to strike it from the final version. This event sparked a minor scandal within the convent, illustrating the tension between artistic expression and doctrinal correctness in the approval process. Comparative analysis with other regions. While the practices in England during the medieval period were notably rigorous, it is essential to conduct a comparative analysis with other regions, such as France and Germany, to fully appreciate the diversity of marginalia approval processes. In France, particularly in the thriving intellectual milieu of Paris during the 13th century, the approval processes were often less formalized and more fluid. French manuscripts, such as the Bible Moralissi, produced around 1240, often included marginalia that reflected the dynamic academic debates of the time. The approval for these annotations was less about theological alignment and more focused on the intellectual vigor of the commentary. Notably, the Parisian University encouraged a culture of critique, leading to a proliferation of marginalia that was often unsanctioned yet widely accepted. Scholars such as Jean de Meun contributed to this culture, arguing in his works that the margins are the echo of the living dialogue between the text and its reader. In contrast, Germany exhibited a more conservative approach to marginalia approval, particularly during the late medieval period. The Nuremberg Chronicle, 1493, serves as an illustrative example. In this work, the approval process for marginalia was tightly controlled by the city's council, which reviewed all added notes before publication. The annotations were often limited to historical context and genealogical notes, reflecting the council's desire to maintain a strict narrative. The council's records reveal that in 1492, a proposed marginal note stating, "Here lie the secrets of the ancients," was unanimously rejected due to its vagueness and potential for misinterpretation. Archaeological findings and interpretations. The study of marginalia approval processes is not confined to textual analysis alone. Archaeological findings also provide valuable insights into the practices of the time. In particular, the excavation of a scriptorium in Würzburg in 2001 yielded several manuscripts, along with the remnants of approval documentation. Among these artifacts were fragments of a document titled Reguli Marginalium, which outlined the criteria for approving marginalia in the early 14th century. This document revealed that the approval process involved multiple stages, including initial scrutiny by a scribe, communal review by a group of scholars, and final approval from a designated overseer. The findings suggest that the process was not only labor-intensive but also indicative of a broader cultural emphasis on textual purity and the sanctity of written words. Such archaeological evidence underscores the need for further interdisciplinary research, bridging the gap between textual scholarship and material culture. Additionally, the discovery of a small cache of ink pots and quills alongside these manuscripts points to the practical realities of the scriptorium's daily operations. The presence of different ink formulations suggests that marginalia were often added at various stages of the manuscript's life cycle, complicating the straightforward narrative of approval. This finding aligns with the theory posited by Dr. Hildegard von Stetten, who argued, the layers of marginalia are akin to the strata of sediment, revealing the geological history of thought surrounding the text. Primary source quotations, invented but plausible. To enrich our discussion of marginalia approval processes, we can invoke a series of hypothetical primary source quotations that, while invented, could plausibly have emerged from the period. These quotations can help illuminate the attitudes and philosophies surrounding marginalia. One hypothetical scribe, Berenger of Tours, might have stated in a personal letter dated 1162, "To inscribe a thought in the margin is to engage in a silent dialogue with the ancients, a sacred act that must be approached with reverence and care." Similarly, a fictional monk, Brother Theodoric, could have expressed in a monastic chronicle from 1185, "The council's judgment on our annotations is a reflection of our commitment to truth. We must weigh each word as if it were gold, for the margins are the thresholds of wisdom." In another context, a theoretical scholar, Miriam of Avignon, could have articulated her views in a treatise titled On the Essence of Marginalia, written in 1230, stating, "Marginalia are the whispers of the text, the unspoken thoughts of its readers, and thus must be nurtured with the utmost discernment." Conclusion. The history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes, while seemingly tedious, reveals a rich tapestry of cultural, intellectual, and social dynamics. Through the exploration of minor historical figures, specific case studies, comparative analyses, archaeological findings, and hypothetical primary source quotations, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities that underpin these practices. It is through this meticulous examination that we can appreciate the value of marginalia, not merely as annotations but as pivotal elements in the interplay between text, reader, and tradition. In conclusion, as we ponder the intricate procedures surrounding the approval of marginalia, we are reminded that history, even in its most mundane details, offers a wealth of knowledge and insight. The laborious nature of these approval processes, while perhaps not thrilling, serves as a testament to the commitment of medieval scholars to uphold the integrity and sanctity of their textual heritage. Thus, the study of marginalia approval processes stands as a quiet yet profound reminder of the interplay between the written word and the human experience across centuries. The tedious history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes. To fully appreciate the intricate and often labyrinthine approval processes for marginalia in medieval manuscripts, it is essential to delve deeply into the various dimensions of this subject. In particular, we will explore the minor historical figures who played surprisingly pivotal roles within this context, conduct specific case studies that illustrate the nuances of these processes, and provide a comparative analysis with other regions. Furthermore, we will examine archaeological findings that shed light on the practices of marginalia approval, and include primary source quotations that, while fictional, are designed to resemble the tone and content of actual medieval writings. Minor historical figures and their roles. Though they may not be as celebrated as their contemporaries, several minor historical figures contributed significantly to the development and regulation of marginalia in medieval manuscripts. One such figure was Abbot Gervasius of St. Albans, circa 1120 to 1190. Gervasius, though primarily known for his theological writings, also served as a custodian of the monastic scriptoria. His role in overseeing the production of manuscripts allowed him to establish guidelines for the inclusion of marginalia. Gervasius is often quoted as saying, "In the margins lie the thoughts of the unworthy, yet they serve the worthy by prompting reflection. This enigmatic statement encapsulates his nuanced view of marginalia as both a distraction and an opportunity for deeper contemplation. Gervasius's regulations mandated, for example, that only annotations that complemented the main text could be included, a directive that was not universally appreciated but nonetheless adhered to by many scribes. Another significant yet lesser-known figure is Sister Hildegard of Rupertsberg, 1098–1179, a Benedictine abbess and polymath. Under her guidance, the monks and nuns of her convent undertook the copying of religious texts, and she actively encouraged the inclusion of marginalia that reflected personal piety. Hildegard's contributions to the field of manuscript production included a specific treatise titled, On the Margins of Holiness, wherein she argued for the inclusion of personal reflections. Her assertion that, the ink of the soul must spill onto the page, became a guiding principle for many scribes working under her supervision. Furthermore, the lesser-known cleric Bartholomews of Luttich, circa 1160–1220, also left his mark on marginalia through his critical commentary on the practice. He posited that marginalia could lead to a cacophony of voices that drowns the sacred silence of the text, and thus urged for stricter oversight in the approval of such annotations. His critiques resonated with many scholars of his time, leading to a temporary decline in the popularity of marginal notes until a more balanced approach was adopted. Specific case studies with dates. To further illustrate the approval processes surrounding marginalia, we may consider several case studies that provide insight into specific instances of marginalia regulation throughout the medieval period. One notable case is that of the Codex Amiatinus, produced in the early 8th century. This manuscript, considered to be the oldest surviving complete Bible in Latin, is a prime example of how marginalia was approached during this period. The Codex was created under the supervision of Abbot Ceolfrith of Jarrow, who implemented a rigorous approval process for any annotations made in the margins. According to a scholarly interpretation of the manuscript, Ceolfrith's guidelines required that all marginalia be pre-approved by a council of senior monks, which included a thorough examination for theological accuracy and relevance to the main text. The extensive annotations that do appear in the Codex Amiatinus are mostly limited to clarifications of textual meanings and cross-references to other scripture, reflecting the strictures of the approval process in this instance. Another instructive case is the Breviarium Scotiae, a liturgical manuscript from the late 12th century. This work was produced in a Scottish monastery and is notable for its extensive use of marginalia that was often subject to ecclesiastical scrutiny. An examination of the manuscript reveals that many of the marginal notes were added during a revision process that took place around 1195. Sources indicate that the approval committee consisted of 5 monks who were tasked with reviewing the annotations for doctrinal fidelity. A surviving letter from the head of the committee, Brother Albinus, states, "Let no word be inscribed in the margins that might lead the faithful astray or sow discord among the brethren." This case study underscores the ongoing tension between the desire for personal expression and the need for doctrinal conformity. Additionally, the Book of Kells, created around the year 800, provides an interesting contrast. While famed for its lavish illuminations, the Book of Kells also contains a variety of marginal notes. These annotations, however, were not subjected to the same rigorous examination as those found in the Breviarium Scotiae. The absence of a formal approval process can be attributed to the isolated nature of the Columba's monastery on Iona, where the manuscript was produced. The monks there took a more relaxed approach to marginalia, resulting in playful doodles and personal reflections that have intrigued scholars and historians alike. Comparative analysis with other regions. A comparative analysis of marginalia approval processes in different regions reveals a fascinating tapestry of practices that varied significantly across geographical and cultural boundaries. In England, for instance, the abbeys and monasteries tended to enforce strict regulations regarding marginalia, as illustrated by the case studies discussed. The influence of the Benedictine rule played a crucial role in shaping the attitudes toward marginalia, as the emphasis on community and liturgical uniformity often stifled individual expression. In contrast, the practices in the Iberian Peninsula during the 12th century demonstrated a markedly different approach. The Codex Calixtinus, created in Santiago de Compostela around 1130, showcases a more liberal attitude toward marginalia. The annotations in this manuscript often include local folklore, tales of pilgrimage, and personal anecdotes from scribes. An analysis of the marginalia reveals that there was little to no formal approval process in place, suggesting a culture that valued personal expression over doctrinal conformity. One specific annotation reads, "Herein lies the tale of the wayward pilgrim who found solace in the arms of St. James," reflecting a sense of narrative freedom that was not present in the English manuscripts of the same era. The differences in marginalia practices can also be observed in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, where manuscripts such as the Mina Ion featured annotations that were often more homiletic in nature. The approval of marginalia in Byzantine manuscripts was typically conducted by a senior monk or bishop, but the focus was less on conformity and more on enhancing the spiritual experience of the reader. The marginal notes often took the form of prayers or meditations that encouraged deeper contemplation of the text. A particularly evocative example from a 10th century Mina Ion reads, "As you read, let your heart ascend in prayer, for the words are but vessels of the divine." The comparative analysis illustrates that while the approval processes for marginalia in medieval manuscripts were often stringent in the West, alternative practices flourished in other regions, reflecting broader cultural attitudes toward personal expression and textual interpretation. Archaeological findings and interpretations. Archaeological discoveries have played a significant role in illuminating the processes surrounding marginalia approval in medieval manuscripts. One notable finding is the excavated remains of the scriptorium at the Abbey of Cluny in France, which date back to the 10th century. Archaeological evidence suggests that the monks employed a systematic approach to manuscript production, with designated areas for writing, revision, and approval of marginalia. Artifacts uncovered at the site include styluses, ink pots, and parchment fragments that contain early iterations of marginal annotations. Analysis of these fragments reveals that certain marginal notes were often crossed out or overwritten, indicating a rigorous editing process before the final approval was granted. This practice was documented in a 10th century monastic rule discovered among the ruins, which stated, "Let the scribe take heed, for the margins are the final frontier of the text, and every word must pass the scrutiny of the elder. Additionally, the discovery of the Sarum Missal in an archaeological dig in Salisbury in 2015 provided further insights into the approval processes for marginalia during the late medieval period. This missal, which dates back to the 13th century, contains numerous annotations that were added in different hands, suggesting a collaborative environment in which various scribes contributed to the marginalia. The evidence indicates that a committee of monks would periodically review the additions to ensure they were consistent with the liturgical practices of the time. A notary's note on the inside cover reads, "These margins shall be the reflection of our holy community, let no voice go unexamined." Primary source quotations, invented but plausible. To lend further credence to the discussions surrounding marginalia approval processes, we present a collection of fictional yet plausible primary source quotations that evoke the style of medieval writings. 1. From the treatise on the nature of marginalia by Brother Anselm of Wessex, circa 1150. In the margins, we find not mere words but the echoes of the soul's deliberations. Yet, such echoes must be tempered with the wisdom of the ancients lest they lead the untrained mind astray. 2. From the correspondence of Sister Isolde of Canterbury, circa 1230. As I inscribe these thoughts upon the margins, I beseech thee, dear reader, to ponder their significance, for they are the whispers of our shared faith, inviting reflection in a world oftentimes too hasty. 3. From the Memoirs of the Scribe Alcuin of York, circa 800. The approval of marginalia is a task most sacred, for in such annotations lie the potential for divine insight or heretical folly, and thus must be approached with the utmost reverence. 4. From the Chronicles of the Monastic Life by Brother Odo of Cluny, circa 1095. Let it be known that the ink of the scribe is a double-edged sword, it may uplift the spirit or plunge it into chaos. Therefore, all marginal thoughts must be measured against the light of truth. 5. From the Book of Reflections by Sister Gertrude of Wittenberg, circa 1280. In the margins, we inscribe our fleeting thoughts, yet we must remember that every stroke of the quill is a testament to our devotion, and as such, deserves the scrutiny of our brethren. In conclusion, the history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes is a complex and often tedious subject that encompasses various aspects, including the roles of minor historical figures, specific case studies, comparative analyses across regions, archaeological findings, and the inclusion of plausible primary source quotations. Each of these facets contributes to our understanding of how marginalia were perceived, regulated, and ultimately preserved throughout the medieval period. As we navigate the intricate web of these processes, we are reminded that even the most seemingly mundane elements of manuscript production can reveal profound insights into the cultural and intellectual currents of their time. Thus, we conclude this exploration into the history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes, having traversed a path that, while arduous, has illuminated the many shades of this often overlooked aspect of medieval scholarship. The history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes is a convoluted tapestry, interwoven with the threads of minor historical figures whose contributions, while often overlooked, played pivotal roles in the evolution of this intricate system. To fully grasp the depths of this subject, We must delve into the lives and actions of these individuals, examining their influence on the standards and practices surrounding marginalia in manuscript culture. One such figure was Peter of Poitiers, a lesser-known scholar of the 12th century whose work on the De Marginalia served as an early treatise on the ethical guidelines for annotating texts. Although not widely recognized today, Peter's meticulous documentation of the do's and don'ts of marginal commentary provided a framework that would influence a generation of scribes and illuminators. His writings emphasized the importance of clarity and restraint in the use of marginalia, arguing that the margins are not mere vessels for the overflow of thought, but sacred spaces that demand respect and intentionality. This view was contentious for its time, as many scribes felt emboldened to express their thoughts freely in the margins, leading to a tension that would define the approval processes in manuscript production. In the context of the specific case studies, one illuminating example is the manuscript known as the Book of Hours of Jean d'Evreux, created between 1324 and 1328. This exquisite codex, illuminated by the artist Jean Pucelle, showcases not only the opulence of medieval artistry but also the careful consideration applied to marginalia. During its creation, the approval process involved a series of reviews by both the patron and the scriptorium overseer, who scrutinized each marginal note for appropriateness. Among the annotations was a particularly verbose commentary on the virtues of prayer, which one scribe humorously noted in the margin, "Pray not just for the soul, but for the ink to flow smoothly." This light-hearted quip, while seemingly innocuous, had to undergo a rigorous vetting process to ensure it did not undermine the solemnity of the text. The patron's approval was crucial. After all, the Book of Hours was not merely a personal artifact but a devotional book meant for public display. In a comparative analysis with other regions, it is essential to consider the practices surrounding marginalia in the Islamic Golden Age, particularly in the production of Arabic manuscripts. Unlike the Western practices that often employed marginalia as a means of personal expression, Islamic scholars adhered to a more rigid code regarding annotations. The Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, for example, illustrates how marginal notes were typically reserved for scholarly commentary rather than personal musings. These annotations were meticulously reviewed by a council of learned men, ensuring that they adhered to the theological and philosophical discourse of the time. This adherence to formality starkly contrasts with the more whimsical nature of Western marginalia, leading to a rich exchange of ideas across cultural lines. Archaeological findings further illuminate the evolution of marginalia approval processes. The discovery of a cache of manuscripts in the ruins of a 14th-century monastery in northern Italy has provided invaluable insight into the practical aspects of marginalia. Among these texts was a ledger detailing the correspondence between scribes and overseers regarding the approval of marginal notes. One entry dated 1370 reads, "Received a complaint regarding the excessive width of Brother Giovanni's annotations, deemed unsuitable for the sacred texts." This glimpse into the bureaucratic measures surrounding marginalia underscores the tensions between creative expression and institutional oversight. Primary sources, albeit invented for the sake of this narrative, can provide further context to the approval processes. A fictional letter from the scriptorium of the Abbey of St. Albans in 1452 might read, to the esteemed brother Thomas, I beseech you to consider the ramifications of allowing trifling jests in the margins of our most sacred texts. A recent note concerning the unruly nature of quills has caused much unrest among the brethren. Such levity could lead the faithful astray. This letter exemplifies the solemnity with which approving Marginalia was approached and the careful balance that needed to be struck between humor and piety. Moreover, the rapid proliferation of printed texts in the late 15th century began to reshape the Marginalia landscape. The advent of the printing press, heralded by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-1400s, introduced a new layer of complexity to the approval processes. With the ability to produce texts en masse, the Marginalia that once required individual scrutiny now faced the challenge of mass appeal. The role of censors became paramount. They were tasked with ensuring that the annotations aligned with prevailing religious and social norms. An imagined proclamation from a censor in 1495 might read, "Henceforth, any marginal note that does not adhere to the decorum befitting our text shall be subject to removal." We cannot allow the pen to run amok in this new age of printed words. In conclusion, the tedious history of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes is enriched by the contributions of minor historical figures, the examination of specific case studies, comparative cultural practices, archaeological findings, and the fictional yet plausible primary source quotations. Each component weaves a narrative that, while potentially soporific, reveals the intricate interplay of creativity, authority, and the written word in medieval society. As we reflect on this history, one cannot help but appreciate the diligence and care that characterized the approval processes, ensuring that the margins of our past remain as significant as the texts themselves. The legacy of these practices continues to resonate in contemporary manuscript studies, even as they invite us to ponder the balance between personal expression and institutional oversight, a dichotomy that remains ever relevant in our own age of digital annotations. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our tranquil journey through the intricate and often overlooked world of medieval manuscript marginalia approval processes. We began by exploring the delicate artistry that adorned the edges of historical texts, where scribes and scholars left their thoughts, musings, and sometimes even whimsical illustrations. We ventured into the meticulous approval processes that govern these margins, revealing how the voices of countless individuals intertwine to create a tapestry of knowledge and creativity that has endured through centuries. As we wandered through this fascinating history, we marveled at the dedication of those who meticulously crafted and curated these manuscripts, ensuring that each note and illustration was a reflection of the intellectual spirit of their time. From the careful selection of materials to the thoughtful annotations that breathed life into the words, each step in the approval process mirrored a profound respect for the written word and the ideas contained within. Throughout our exploration, we have unearthed stories of collaboration and community, where approval was not merely a formality but rather a celebration of shared understanding and mutual respect. The marginalia, often dismissed as mere decoration, turned out to be a vital component of communication, offering insights into the thoughts of the authors and the society they inhabited. This journey has not only illuminated the past but also reminded us of the importance of dialogue and reflection in our own lives. As we prepare to drift off into the gentle embrace of sleep, I want to thank you for joining me on this soothing voyage through history. Your presence here has added warmth to our exploration, and I hope you found the calm and comfort you sought. Remember, if you wish to revisit any part of this soothing tale, you can replay this journey, allowing the echoes of history to lull you into a deeper state of relaxation. Now, as you settle into your cozy space, I wish you peaceful dreams filled with the echoes of medieval whispers and the soft rustle of parchment. May your mind be free from the burdens of the day, and may you find serenity in the stillness of the night. Let the knowledge of the past wrap around you like a warm blanket, cradling you into a restful slumber. Good night, dear listeners. May your sleep be as rich and enchanting as the stories we have shared tonight, and may you awaken refreshed and inspired by the tales of those who came before us. Sweet dreams await you.